Imagine a world where one man's words could ignite a firestorm, where scholars and leaders alike trembled at the power of a single pen. This wasn't just any world, it was the 16th century, a time of great change and upheaval in Europe. At the center of this storm was a man named Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch scholar who dared to challenge the status quo and question the very foundations of the Church. But Erasmus was no ordinary rebel. He was a man of deep intellect and wit, a master of Latin and Greek, and a key figure in the Renaissance movement. Yet, despite his brilliance, Erasmus found himself caught between two worlds, the old and the new, the Catholic Church and the Reformers. His story is one of courage, compromise, and the complex realities of a time when the world was on the brink of transformation. In the early 1500s, the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Europe. It held sway over kings and emperors, and its influence extended into every aspect of daily life. But beneath this veneer of power, the Church was riddled with corruption. Priests and monks were often more concerned with their own wealth and power than with the spiritual well-being of their flock. The sale of indulgences, a practice that allowed people to pay for the forgiveness of their sins, was just one of the many scandals that eroded the Church's moral authority. Enter Erasmus. He was a man of letters, a scholar who believed that the Church could be reformed from within. Unlike the fiery reformers who sought to break away from the Church entirely, Erasmus believed in the power of words and ideas to bring about change. He saw the Church's corruption and the need for reform, but he also saw the value in the Church's role in society. To Erasmus, the Church was a necessary institution that could be improved through education and intellectual discourse. One of Erasmus's most famous works, The Praise of Folly, was a satirical critique of the Church and society. Through the voice of folly, he exposed the absurdities and hypocrisies of his time. He mocked the pretensions of scholars and the greed of the clergy, but he did so with a gentle wit that invited reflection rather than anger. This approach won him many admirers, including some within the Church hierarchy, who saw him as a voice of reason and reform. However, Erasmus's moderate stance also made him enemies. The more radical reformers, like Martin Luther, saw him as too soft and unwilling to take a firm stand against the Church. Luther, a German monk, had famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church in 1517, calling for an end to the sale of indulgences and other corrupt practices. His bold actions and fiery rhetoric quickly gained him a following, and he soon became the leader of a movement that would come to be known as the Protestant Reformation. At first, Erasmus and Luther seemed to be on the same side. Luther admired Erasmus's intellect and his critique of the Church, and Erasmus in turn praised Luther's courage. But as the Reform movement gained momentum, the differences between the two men became more apparent. Luther was a man of action, willing to break away from the Church and start a new one if necessary. Erasmus, on the other hand, was a man of ideas, believing that change could be achieved through persuasion and debate. The rift between Erasmus and Luther widened as the Reformation progressed. Luther's followers began to use more extreme language, denouncing the Pope and the Church in harsh terms. They called for violence against those who opposed them, and their message became increasingly radical. Erasmus, who valued reason and civility, was appalled by this turn of events. He saw the Reformation as a necessary but dangerous movement, one that could lead to chaos and division if not carefully managed. In 1524, Erasmus wrote a book called On Free Will, in which he criticized Luther's doctrine of predestination. Predestination, the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, was a central tenet of Luther's theology. Erasmus, however, believed that humans had free will and could choose their own path to salvation. This book marked a clear break between Erasmus and Luther, and it led to a bitter exchange of letters between the two men. Luther, who had once called Erasmus the Morning Star of Wittenberg, now denounced him as a coward and a heretic. He accused Erasmus of being more concerned with his own reputation than with the truth. Erasmus, for his part, was deeply hurt by Luther's attacks. He had always seen himself as a man of peace, someone who sought to bridge the gap between different factions. But now he found himself caught in the middle of a religious war, with both sides accusing him of betrayal. The Catholic Church, too, was not pleased with Erasmus. Despite his criticisms of the Church, he had never formally broken away from it. But his calls for reform and his support for the study of the Bible in the original languages were seen as dangerous by many church leaders. They accused him of being a secret supporter of the reformers and a threat to the church's authority. In 1520, when Pope Leo X issued a decree excommunicating Luther, some even suggested that Erasmus should be included in the excommunication. Erasmus's position became increasingly precarious. He was a scholar without a home, a man who had made enemies on both sides of the religious divide. In 1521, he left the University of Louvain, where he had been teaching, after facing growing opposition from conservative colleagues. He moved to Basel, Switzerland, where he hoped to find a more tolerant environment. But even in Basel, he was not entirely safe. The city was divided between those who supported the Reformation and those who remained loyal to the Church. Despite the challenges, Erasmus continued to write and publish. He produced commentaries on the New Testament, translated ancient texts, and corresponded with leading figures across Europe. His influence was felt far beyond the narrow confines of religious debate. He championed the idea of a universal education, arguing that all people, not just the elite, should have access to learning. He believed that education was the key to a more just and peaceful society, and he worked tirelessly to promote this vision. But Erasmus's greatest legacy may be his role in the humanist movement. Humanism was a Renaissance philosophy that placed a high value on human potential and emphasized the study of classical texts. Erasmus was a leading figure in this movement, and his works helped to spread humanist ideas throughout Europe. He believed that the study of the classics could lead to a deeper understanding of human nature and a more ethical way of life. His translations and commentaries on ancient texts made them accessible to a wider audience, and his emphasis on critical thinking and intellectual curiosity inspired generations of scholars. In the end, Erasmus's vision of a reformed church and a more enlightened society was not fully realized in his lifetime. The religious wars that followed the Reformation were long and bloody, and the divisions between Catholics and Protestants deepened over the years. But Erasmus's ideas continue to resonate, and his influence can be seen in the Enlightenment of the 18th century and beyond. Today, Erasmus is remembered as a man of great intellect and moral courage. He dared to challenge the powerful and to speak truth to those in authority. He believed in the power of reason and the potential for human progress, and he worked tirelessly to promote these ideals. His life and works remind us that change is often difficult, and that true reform requires both courage and wisdom. In a world still grappling with many of the same issues, Erasmus's legacy remains as relevant as ever.